The humid air of St. Helena Parish, Louisiana, on March 14, 1853, was thick enough to drink. It carried the sweet, cloying scent of magnolia blossoms from the trees surrounding the Greensburg courthouse, a smell that mixed uneasily with the tang of sweat and animal dung from the square. This was a day like any other for a public auction. Furniture, livestock, parcels of land, and human beings would change hands with the same bureaucratic efficiency. The men gathered there, plantation owners, merchants, tradesmen, understood the rules of this world. It was a world built on a simple, brutal premise, that some people were property, and that the transfer of that property was a matter of law and commerce, no different from selling a horse or a barrel of flour. But the transaction that was about to take place on the courthouse steps was different. It was a quiet, calculated act of psychological warfare disguised as a simple sale. The central figure was a pregnant woman named Claraara. She stood apart from the other lots, her hands bound loosely in front of her. She was approximately 23 years old, though no official record of her birth existed. She was described in the ledger as house-trained and literate, though the recorder, a man named Nathaniel Puit, had noted that such a skill was of questionable value. The most critical detail, however, was the minimum bid set by her owner, Duncan Fairholme. It was not $12, it was 12 cents, the price of a loaf of bread. This was not an error. It was a message. In an economy where a healthy, enslaved woman of childbearing age could be sold for $800 to $1,000, a price of 12 cents was a public declaration that this woman was considered worthless, damaged goods. It was a value so low it was an insult, not just to the woman, but to the very idea of bidding on her. Duncan Fairholme watched from a courthouse window. He was a man in his late 40s, his face set in lines of permanent authority. He had not arrived at this decision out of mere cruelty, though cruelty was certainly a tool he was willing to use. This was a strategic move in a private domestic war. The child Claraara carried was not his, it was his younger brother William's. William, the family idealist, the one who read dangerous books and questioned the foundations of their world, had committed the ultimate transgression in Duncan's eyes. He had formed a human connection with property. He had fallen in love with Claraara. Duncan's plan was not to simply be rid of her. He wanted to demonstrate his absolute power. He wanted to humiliate William by showing him that the woman he loved was worth less than the change in his pocket. And most cunningly, by setting the price so absurdly low, he ensured that no serious bidder would be interested. Who would waste even $1 on a woman so clearly flawed? His plan was for his overseer, a brutal man named Silas Guthrie, to be the only bidder to acquire Claraara for a pittance, and to thereby complete her descent into a hell of William's making, a hell William would be forced to watch. It was a perfect, airtight plan of domination. But as the auctioneer began his chant, a voice from the back of the crowd, calm and clear, cut through the humid air. 12 cents. Every head turned. The man who had spoken was a stranger. The stranger stood at the edge of the crowd, a tall, lean figure in a traveler's coat dusty from the road. His face was weathered by sun and wind, suggesting a life spent outdoors, but he carried himself with a stillness that set him apart from the field hands and farmers. He did not fidget or look away when eyes fell upon him. He met the gaze of Nathaniel Puit, who stood on the courthouse steps with the deed of sale in his hand. Puit, a man whose ambition far outstripped his current station, was flustered. This was not in the script. Duncan Fairholme had assured him the sale would be a mere formality, a quiet transaction with Silas Guthrie. "Your name, sir?" Puit asked, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. "Isaiah Mercer," the man replied. He stepped forward and placed 12 copper pennies, one by one, on the wooden podium. The sound of each coin hitting the wood was unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Do you have 12 cents, Mr. Mercer?" Puit asked, stating the obvious in his confusion. "I do," Mercer said, his voice low and even. From his position near the courthouse door, Judge Amos Crenshaw watched this development with a furrowed brow. He was there as a silent partner to Duncan's plan, a guardian of the legal framework that made such a transaction possible. An unknown variable was problematic. Silas Guthrie, standing near the front, felt a hot flush of anger creep up his neck. He had been instructed to wait, to let the crowd's disinterest become apparent, and then to step in and claim Claraara as if he were doing Bellamont a favor by taking this worthless property off their hands. This stranger was ruining everything. He glanced toward the courthouse window, but could only see the vague shadow of Duncan behind the glass. Pweet, seeking guidance, looked toward Judge Crenshaw, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The law was the law. A bid had been made. 12 cents once, Pweet called out, his voice cracking. He waited, staring at Guthrie. The overseer's jaw tightened. If he bid now, he would reveal his specific interest. He would be publicly bidding on a woman everyone now believed was worthless. It would raise questions, but if he did not bid, she would go to this stranger. The seconds stretched. 12 cents twice. Guthrie could wait no longer. 13 cents, he snapped. The crowd, which had been murmuring, now fell completely silent. This was becoming interesting. Isaiah Mercer did not even glance in Guthrie's direction. 25 cents, he said, his tone as calm as if he were commenting on the weather. 50 cents, Guthrie retorted, his face growing redder. $1, Mercer said. The bidding war had begun. The crowd was riveted. Two men were now actively competing for a woman being sold as refuse. What did they know that everyone else did not? The price climbed to $2, then $5. At $10, Guthrie stopped. Duncan had been explicit. Do not overpay. Do not draw attention. The whole point was to make this seem insignificant. $10 for a woman worth 12 cents was the opposite of insignificant. It was a spectacle. $10 once, Pweet called out, looking desperately toward the judge. $10 twice. Judge Crenshaw gave another small nod. The transaction was legal. There was no grounds to stop it. Sold to Mr. Isaiah Mercer for $10. The gavel fell. As Mercer stepped forward to complete the paperwork, Duncan Fairholme emerged from the courthouse, his composure finally broken. Mr. Mercer, he said, his voice sharp with contained fury. A moment of your time. The wagon was a simple, rugged farm cart, its wood worn smooth by use. A faded canvas cover was stretched over hoops in the back, offering some shelter from the sun. Isaiah Mercer helped Claraara into the back of the wagon, his touch firm but not unkind. It was the touch of a man handling a valuable, fragile object, not a piece of property. He did not speak as he climbed onto the driver's bench, took the reins, and urged the single horse forward. They moved through the streets of Greensburg, past the whitewashed storefronts and the church with its proud steeple. Claraara sat in the back, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The small, sharp weight of the knife sewn into her dress hem was a constant, cold reminder of the desperation she had felt just hours before. Now, that desperation was mixed with a profound disorientation. Who was this man? Why had he paid $10 for her? Why had he bid against Silas Guthrie? She had seen the look in Duncan Fairholme's eyes as they left the square, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. This man, Mercer, had not just purchased a slave, he had publicly challenged one of the most powerful men in the parish. That was a dangerous game. They reached the edge of town, where the cultivated fields gave way to a dense forest of pine and oak. The sounds of the town faded, replaced by the creak of the wagon, the clop of the horses' hooves, and the buzz of insects. Only then did Isaiah Mercer speak, his voice calm and measured, carrying easily over the sounds of their travel. "You do not remember me," he said. It was not a question. Claraara's blood ran cold. Her past was a closed book, a series of painful chapters she rarely allowed herself to read. "Should I?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Richmond," he said. "August, 1845. You were 15 years old. I was there the day you were sold." A jolt, like lightning, went through her. A memory was a physical pain, the rough wood of the auction block, the sea of strange white faces, the crushing grip of the trader's hand on her arm, and the sound of her mother's scream as she was led away. She had buried that sound deep inside her, but now it echoed in her ears as if it were yesterday. Rage, hot and bitter, filled her throat. "You were at the auction," she said, her voice tight. "I was," he replied, his eyes still on the road ahead. "I was working for a man named Ephraim Dalton, a slave trader. I drove his wagons. I managed his property. I watched you and your family stand on that block. I watched your mother scream. I watched Edmund Fairholme, Duncan's father, pay $700 and lead you away. Then you are no different than the rest of them, Claraara spat, the hope she hadn't even realized she'd felt turning to ash in her mouth. He was just another link in the chain that had bound her life. There was a long pause. The wagon rolled on, the forest growing thicker around them. I was no different, he said, and the weight in his voice was immense, a burden of years. I am no longer that man. He then did something that shocked her. He reached into his coat, and without taking his eyes from the road, he handed a folded piece of paper back to her. Read it, he said. With trembling hands, Claraara unfolded the paper. The script was formal, the language legal and precise. It was a deed of manumission, a document that granted freedom, and the name written on it was hers. Claraara. No last name, because she had never been allowed one. She stared at the paper, the words swimming before her eyes. It was a thing she had never dared to dream of, a possibility so remote it belonged to the realm of fantasy. And now it was here, in her hands, signed and sealed. But it was just a piece of paper. Without being filed with the parish authorities, it was as worthless. It needed the stamp of the very system that had enslaved her. She looked from the paper to the back of Isaiah Mercer's head. The question was too enormous to voice. Why? The story of Isaiah Mercer was not one of sudden, blinding revelation, but of a slow, grinding erosion of conscience. He had been a young man from a poor white family in Virginia with few prospects. Working for a slave trader was a job, one that paid better than most. He told himself he was just moving cargo. He hardened his heart to the cries and the despair, focusing on the mechanics of the journey, feeding the people in his care, maintaining the wagons, following his boss's orders. The day in Richmond had been like any other, blisteringly hot, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. He remembered Claraara because she was different. While others wept or stared vacantly, she had held herself with a quiet dignity that seemed to defy the reality of the auction block. Her eyes were not downcast, they took in everything, storing it away. He remembered the precise moment her family was separated. He remembered the sound her mother made, a sound that was less a scream and more the tearing of a soul. It was a sound that, unlike others, did not fade from his memory. It followed him. It stayed with him on the long wagon rides, in the taverns at night, in the silence of his own room. For years he buried it, told himself it was sentimentality, a weakness, but the sound was a seed, and it grew in the dark soil of his soul. The final break came on a trip to New Orleans. They were transporting a group of enslaved people, including a young man who tried to escape. Mercer's boss, Dalton, had made an example of the young man, a punishment so brutal and prolonged that it finally shattered the wall Mercer had built around himself. He looked at the blood on the ground, heard the whimpers of the other captives, and all he could hear was that mother's scream from years before multiplied. He quit that very night. He didn't just walk away from the job, he walked away from the man he had been. He spent the next several years drifting, working odd jobs, but his purpose had clarified. He sought out others who felt as he did, a scattered network of Quakers, free blacks and sympathetic whites who operated in the shadows. They couldn't dismantle the system, but they could pick at its seams. They could rescue individuals. When he heard through the intricate grapevine that connected these groups about Claraara's situation, a pregnant woman being sold for 12 cents in a Louisiana parish as a punishment, something clicked in his memory. The girl from Richmond. The mother's scream. It felt like a circle he was meant to close. This was not just another rescue, it was atonement. As he explained this to Claraara, the wagon continued its journey, not north on the main road, but east toward the swamplands that bordered the Mississippi. The deed is the first step, he told her, but it's just paper. Duncan Fairholme will have men looking for us. He can't let this stand. His authority depends on it. We can't just run, we have to disappear. Their destination, he explained, was not a city or a town. It was a place called Cypress Hollow, a maroon community hidden deep in the impassable swamps. It was a settlement of free blacks and runaways who had carved out a life for themselves, completely independent of the white world. It was a secret, a rumor, a legend. Its existence was a threat to every slave owner in the South because it proved that their system was not absolute. To reach it, they would have to leave the wagon behind and travel by boat through waterways known only to a few. It was a dangerous journey, but it was the only path to a freedom that was more than just a signature on a piece of paper. It was a freedom built by their own hands. Back in Greensburg, in the wood-paneled quiet of Judge Amos Crenshaw's chambers, 3 men were engaged in the careful business of rewriting history. Duncan Fairholme paced before the judge's heavy oak desk, his anger a cold, sharp thing in the room. Nathaniel Puitt sat nervously in a high-backed chair, the deed of sale to Isaiah Mercer held tightly in his hands. Judge Crenshaw remained seated, his fingers steepled, the picture of judicial calm. "He humiliated me," Duncan said, his voice low and venomous. "Publicly. He made a mockery of the auction of my authority." "The transaction was legal, Duncan," the judge replied evenly. "The man made a bid. He paid the price. There is no legal recourse." "There is always a recourse," Duncan countered. "He is a stranger. He could be an abolitionist agent. He could be anything. He took what is mine." The key word was mine. To Duncan, Claraara was not a person. She was a symbol of his dominion over his brother, over his property, over the natural order of his world. Her loss was not the loss of a human life, but a crack in the foundation of his power, and cracks had to be repaired, or the entire structure could collapse. "Silas is preparing to follow them," Duncan said. "He will take 2 other men. They will retrieve my property and deal with this Mercer." Judge Crenshaw nodded slowly. He was not a man of violence himself, but he understood its necessity in upholding the system he served. The law was one tool, the whip was another. They were 2 sides of the same coin. "The records, however, are a problem," the judge said, turning his gaze to Nathaniel Puitt. Puitt straightened up. "Your Honor?" "This sale," Crenshaw said, gesturing to the paper in Puitt's hand. "It is irregular. It draws attention. It creates a story. We do not need stories. We need silence." Understanding dawned on Puitt's face. He was an ambitious man, and he knew that his future depended on the favor of men like Duncan Fairholme and Judge Crenshaw. "The official ledger could be amended," Puitt suggested cautiously. "It could show that the woman was sold to a John Doe for a nominal fee, to settle an estate debt, a routine matter." "And the original receipt?" Duncan asked. "The one with Mercer's name on it?" Judge Crenshaw smiled, a thin, bloodless smile. "I am having some renovations done to the courthouse next month. The walls in the records room need replastering. It is astonishing what can be lost in the walls of an old building for a century or more." It was decided. The conspiracy of silence began in that moment. The official record would be altered. Claraara's name would be scrubbed from the ledger as if she had never existed. The receipt that told the true story, the 12-cent bid, the bidding war, the sale to Isaiah Mercer for $10, would be sealed inside a courthouse wall, hidden from history. The 7 men who had witnessed the sale as a matter of legal formality would be encouraged to forget what they had seen. It was a clean, efficient erasure. They were not just hiding a crime, they were maintaining a reality in which their power was absolute and unchallenged. As Duncan left the courthouse to give Silas Guthrie his final orders, he felt a sense of restored control. The law and its enforcers were on his side. The variable named Isaiah Mercer would be eliminated, and the natural order would be restored. He did not know that Mercer was a man who had already broken from that order, and that he was leading Claraara into a world where Duncan's power meant nothing. The Pine Barrens gave way to a different landscape altogether, a vast, trackless expanse of swamp. The air grew heavier, saturated with the smell of stagnant water, decay, and blooming water hyacinths. The solid ground became a memory, replaced by a confusing maze of bayous, sloughs, and hummocks of semi-solid earth. Isaiah Mercer had hidden a small flat-bottomed pirogue, a narrow dugout canoe, in a thicket of cattails. The wagon would go no further. "We leave it here," he said to Claraara, helping her out of the cart. "From now on, we travel by water." He gathered a few supplies, a sack of food, a water skin, a rifle, and the precious deed of manumission, which he placed in an oilcloth pouch. He pushed the pirogue into the tea-colored water and held it steady as Claraara carefully climbed in, settling in the front, the knife in her dress hem pressed against her leg, a cold, hard comfort. Mercer pushed off from the bank with a long pole, and they glided silently into the labyrinth. The swamp was a world unto itself, both beautiful and terrifying. Giant cypress trees rose from the water, their knobby knees protruding like the bones of the earth. Spanish moss hung in grey, ghostly curtains, brushing against them as they passed. The sounds were a constant chorus, the deep, resonant call of bullfrogs, the whine of mosquitoes, the sudden splash of a turtle or an alligator sliding off a log. Mercer moved with a quiet confidence, poling the pirogue through channels that were invisible to Claraara's eyes. He knew this place. He had been here before. As they navigated the silent waterways, he told her more about Cypress Hollow. It wasn't a paradise. Life there was hard. They lived in raised cabins on the few patches of high ground, hunted and fished for their food, and grew small gardens. They were in a constant state of vigilance for slave patrols and bounty hunters sometime. Es ventured into the fringes of the swamp, though they rarely dared its deep heart. The community was governed by its own rules, led by a man named Joseph, a runaway who had been free for 20 years. "It is a place where you answer to no white man," Mercer said, "where your child will be born free and will never know the weight of a chain." Claraara listened, her hand resting on her swollen belly. The idea was so vast, so foreign, she could barely comprehend it. Freedom was not just the absence of a master, it was the presence of a self, a life that she could define. For the first time since she could remember, a flicker of something other than fear or resignation began to glow within her. It was a fragile, tentative feeling. Hope. Behind them, miles back but relentless, Silas Guthrie and his two companions had reached the edge of the swamp. They stood at the bank, looking out over the impenetrable green. They had found the abandoned wagon. "He's taken her into the morass," one of the men said, spitting into the water. "We'll never find them in there." Guthrie's face was a mask of grim determination. "We'll find them," he said. "I know these swamps, and I know a man at the trading post who might know the ways in. Nobody hides from Duncan Fairholme, not even in hell itself." The chase was now a race against time and terrain, a pursuit into a world where the usual rules of power and property did not apply. The journey through the swamp lasted 2 days and 2 nights. They slept in the pirogue, pulled up onto a small hummock, the sounds of the wilderness their only lullaby. Claraara's fear began to be replaced by a weary endurance. The physical discomfort was immense. The biting insects, the damp chill, the constant unsteady motion of the boat. But it was a price she was willing to pay. On the morning of the 3rd day, they entered a narrow, hidden channel almost completely blocked by a fallen cypress. Mercer had to pole them carefully over the trunk. As they emerged on the other side, the landscape opened up. They came to a large, relatively clear lagoon, and on the far side, nestled among the cypress knees on a sizable island of high ground, was Cypress Hollow. It was not a town, it was a village, a cluster of perhaps 24 cabins built from cypress wood and palmetto fronds, raised on stilts against the seasonal floods. Smoke curled from a few chimneys. Small, carefully tended garden plots were visible between the trees. Children played near the water's edge, and their laughter, a sound Claraara had not heard in what felt like a lifetime, carried clearly across the lagoon. As Mercer poled them closer, people emerged from the cabins. They were all black, men and women dressed in simple, homespun clothes. They watched the approaching pirogue, not with fear, but with a calm, watchful alertness. A tall, broad-shouldered man with greying hair stepped to the front of the group. This was Joseph. Mercer raised a hand in greeting, and Joseph nodded in return. The pirogue slid onto the muddy shore. Joseph helped Claraara out of the boat. His hands were strong and calloused, but his touch was gentle. He looked at her, and then at her pregnant belly, and his eyes held a deep, knowing kindness. "Welcome," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You are safe here." Those 4 words struck Claraara with a force that nearly buckled her knees. "You are safe here." She had not been safe since she was a small child. Safety was a concept as mythical as the stories of Africa her mother had whispered to her. To have it offered to her now, so simply and directly, was overwhelming. Mercer spoke quietly with Joseph, explaining the situation. Duncan Fairholme, the price, the likely pursuit. Joseph listened, his expression grave. "We have seen his kind before," he said. "Their pride will not let them rest. We will post lookouts." He then turned back to Claraara. "This is your home now," he said. "You will have a cabin. You will work because everyone here works. You will contribute what you can. Your child will be a free child of Cypress Hollow." He assigned a woman named Sarah, a midwife and one of the community's elders, to look after Claraara. As Sarah led her toward a small, empty cabin at the edge of the clearing, Claraara looked back at Isaiah Mercer. He was still talking with Joseph, but he met her gaze and gave a single, slow nod. The debt he felt he owed had been paid. The circle was closed. She was here. She was free. Now she had to learn what it meant to live. Life in Cypress Hollow was a lesson in a new kind of discipline. It was not the discipline of obedience to a master, but the discipline of communal survival. Claraara's literacy, a skill that had been deemed of questionable value by Nathaniel Puett, became immediately vital. She began by helping Sarah with her herbal remedies, carefully writing down the names of plants and their uses in a ledger that Joseph provided. She taught the children their letters, using a stick to trace them in the dirt. She was no longer property. She was a scribe, a teacher, a valued member of a society. The days fell into a rhythm. She woke with the sun, helped with the communal cooking, tended her small garden plot, and spent her afternoons with the children or assisting Sarah. Her body, long accustomed to the specific strains of servitude, slowly adapted to the different strains of freedom, the ache of muscles used in building and planting, the profound tiredness that came from a day's work that was, for the first time, her own. The community was not without its tensions. There were arguments over resources, over chores, over the small frictions of any group living in close quarters. But these disputes were settled by Joseph and a council of elders, not by the crack of a whip. The justice was rough, but it was their justice. Meanwhile, Silas Guthrie and his 2 men had found a guide, a trapper named LeBlanc, who knew the swamp and, for a price, was willing to lead white men into its depths. Their progress was slow and frustrating. The swamp did not yield its secrets easily. LeBlanc was cautious, knowing the reputation of Cypress Hollow and the men who defended it. He had no desire to be shot for a handful of Duncan Fairholme's dollars. He led them on a winding, circuitous route, claiming the direct paths were too dangerous. Guthrie, his patience wearing thin, grew increasingly suspicious that the trapper was stalling. Back at Bellamont, Duncan Fairholme received a cryptic message from Guthrie, delivered by a nervous boy from a nearby farm. The message simply said they were on the trail, deep in the swamp. It was not the swift resolution Duncan had hoped for. Every day that passed was a fresh insult. Claraara's absence was a silence that screamed of his failure. He began to drink more heavily, his anger turning inward, festering. He thought of his brother, William, who had simply vanished. He wondered if William knew, if he was somehow laughing at him. The orderly world he had built was proving to be more fragile than he had ever imagined. In Cypress Hollow, Claraara's time grew near. Sarah stayed with her often, preparing for the birth. One evening, as they sat together sorting herbs, Claraara asked Sarah about her own past. Sarah had run away from a plantation in Georgia 20 years prior. She had lost a child to fever during her first brutal year in the swamp. "This place," Sarah said, gesturing to the community around them, "it is built on loss. Every person here carries a sorrow, but we carry it together. That is what makes us strong. That is what makes us free." Claraara understood. Her own loss, her mother, her family, William, would always be a part of her. But here, it did not define her. Here, she could build something new upon that foundation of pain. The child kicking inside her was the first stone. The confrontation, when it came, was not a dramatic battle. It was an anticlimax, which is often the way of real-world conflicts. Silas Guthrie, LeBlanc and the two other men finally found the hidden channel leading to the lagoon. It was early morning, and a low mist hung over the water, obscuring the village. Guthrie, eager and reckless, pushed forward in their rented pirogue, but the lookouts of Cypress Hollow had seen them hours before. As Guthrie's boat entered the lagoon, two other pirogues emerged from the mist, blocking their path. In each boat stood 3 men from the community, armed with rifles. They did not point them, but held them in a way that made their intention clear. Joseph was in the lead boat. "You have come far enough," Joseph said, his voice carrying across the still water. Guthrie stood up, his own rifle in his hand. "I've come for what's mine, the woman and the child she carries. Hand them over, and there doesn't need to be any trouble." "There is no yours here," Joseph replied calmly. "There is only us. You are trespassing." Guthrie laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Trespassing? This is Louisiana. That woman is the legal property of Duncan Fairholme. You are all fugitives. The law is on my side." It was then that Isaiah Mercer stood up in the second pirogue. He had not spoken until now. "The law?" Mercer's voice was quiet but cut through the air like a knife. "The law that set her price at 12 cents to humiliate a brother? The law that you and Duncan Fairholme and Judge Crenshaw conspired to break by altering the public records? The law that you are now breaking by pursuing a free woman with a legal deed of manumission?" He held up the oilcloth pouch. "I have the document right here, Guthrie, and I have sworn statements from associates in New Orleans detailing Duncan's entire scheme. If we do not return, those statements will be published. Duncan Fairholme will be ruined. His reputation, his standing, everything he cares about, it will all be gone. You are not chasing property. You are chasing the destruction of your master." Guthrie stared, his confidence evaporating. He was a man of violence, not of politics or legal nuance. He understood the threat of a rifle, but the threat of scandal was a weapon he did not know how to counter. Duncan's primary instruction had been to avoid a scene. This was the biggest scene imaginable. LeBlanc the trapper, sensing the shift, began to back his pole into the water. "This is not what I signed up for, Guthrie," he muttered. "I'm not dying for this." The armed men in the pirogues hadn't moved. Their silence was more threatening than any shout. Guthrie looked from their grim faces to Mercer's unwavering gaze, to the sealed pouch in his hand. He had lost. He could shoot, and maybe he'd kill 1 or 2 of them, but he and his men would certainly be killed in return, and even if he succeeded, it would only ensure Duncan's public ruin. He lowered his rifle. "This isn't over," he snarled, a weak and hollow threat. "It is," Joseph said. "For you, it is over. You will leave this place. You will tell Duncan Fairholme that his property is gone, that it never existed. If you or any of his men ever come here again, you will not leave." There was no bravado in the statement, only a simple declaration of fact. Defeated, Guthrie nodded to his men. They turned their pirogue around and disappeared back into the mist from which they had come. The system of power, for the first time in Claraara's life, had been forced to retreat. Claraara gave birth to a son a week later. The labor was long and difficult, but Sarah was a skilled midwife, and the women of the community took turns assisting, bringing food and caring for her. When the baby was finally born, healthy and loud, they placed him in her arms. She named him Samuel. It was a name from the Bible, a name that meant God has heard. She did not know if God had heard, but she knew she had. She had heard her own strength. She had heard the promise of a future. As she nursed her son in the quiet of her cabin, she thought about the intricate web of events that had brought her here. Duncan's cruelty, William's love, Mercer's atonement, Joseph's protection. It was a story of opposing forces, control and rebellion, hatred and love, despair and hope. She was the point where they all intersected. She was the prize that had been fought over, but she was no longer a prize. She was a person, a mother, a teacher, a free woman. Isaiah Mercer stayed in Cypress Hollow for another month, helping to reinforce the palisades and train the lookouts. Before he left to continue his work elsewhere, he gave Claraara the deed of manumission. "It is yours," he said. "A piece of paper will not make you free, Claraara. You have already done that yourself. But it is a symbol. Keep it safe." She did. She kept it wrapped in oilcloth and hidden in a hole in the floor of her cabin. Samuel grew strong in the swampland. He learned to fish and to track. He learned his letters from his mother. He never knew the weight of a chain, the bite of a whip, the feeling of being owned. He was the living embodiment of his mother's victory. The story of the 12-cent slave faded into legend, then into obscurity. The receipt remained sealed in the courthouse wall in Greensburg for 144 years, a secret heartbeat of a forgotten truth. When it was finally discovered in 1897 by renovators, local historians who examined it understood its power immediately. They saw the 12-cent bid, the $10 sale to Isaiah Mercer, the names of the 7 witnesses. And on the back, in a delicate, now faded script they did not recognize, was a single word: Cyprus. They knew what they held. It was not just a historical document, it was a key to a door that had been deliberately walled up. It was proof of the cruelty, the conspiracy, and the resistance. And they made a choice. They reburied it. They chose the comfort of a quiet present over the disruptive truth of the past. The story of Claraara is more than a tale of slavery and freedom. It is a lesson in the architecture of power. It shows that control is maintained not just through force, but through narrative. The powerful write the history books. They bury the receipts. They silence the stories that challenge their version of reality. But the truth has a way of persisting. It hides in swamps, in the memories of children, in the faint script on the back of a hidden document. The question this story leaves us with is not about the past. It is about the present. What stories are being buried today? What receipts are being sealed in the walls? What is the true price of your own freedom, and what are you willing to do to claim it? The auction block is never truly gone. It just takes new forms. The year was 1897. The St. Helena Parish Courthouse, a building that had witnessed decades of quiet complicity, was undergoing long overdue renovations. The air was thick with the dust of old plaster and the scent of fresh-cut pine. A workman, his hands calloused and his mind on his wages, was tasked with breaking through a section of the interior wall behind what had been the old recorder's office. His sledgehammer struck the lath and plaster, and as a large chunk of it crumbled away, something fluttered to the floorboards at his feet. It was a small, tightly rolled sheaf of papers, tied with a brittle piece of twine, remarkably preserved in the dry, dark tomb of the wall. He nearly threw it aside with the rest of the debris, but something, perhaps the formal appearance of the documents, made him pause. He untied the twine and carefully flattened the pages. The script was the elegant, looping cursive of a bygone era. He could read well enough to understand the gravity of what he held. It was a bill of sale for a human being, a pregnant woman named Claraara, sold for 12 cents. The final sale price was $10 to an Isaiah Mercer. The workman, a man named Eli, felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He knew this was not something to be handled lightly. He took the papers directly to the head of the Parish Historical Society, a retired school teacher and local gentleman of some standing named Mr. Thaddeus Moss. Moss was in his study, surrounded by the safe, curated history of the parish, ledgers of cotton yields, maps of old plantations, portraits of stern-faced founding fathers. When Eli presented him with the found documents, Moss adjusted his spectacles and began to read. The more he read, the more the comfortable temperature of the room seemed to drop. Here, in his hands, was not the sanitized history he curated. This was a raw, screaming nerve, the 12-centaur. T-bid was a calculated act of dehumanization so profound it took his breath away. The involvement of names still whispered with respect in the parish, Fairholme, Crenshaw, was damning, and the single word Cyprus written on the back in a different hand was a mystery that pointed toward a truth he instinctively knew was dangerous. He thanked Eli, paid him a silver dollar for his discretion, and sent him on his way. Then he sat alone as the afternoon light faded. He summoned 2 other prominent men of the town, the mayor and the editor of the local newspaper. He laid the documents before them. For a long time, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. They understood the implications immediately. This was not just a historical curiosity. This was a live wire that could electrocute the present. To make this public would be to tear open old wounds that had only just begun to scar over. It would shatter the carefully maintained narratives of noble, if misguided, ancestors. It would cast a pall over the respected families whose donations built the new library and whose names were on the church pews. It would invite scrutiny, controversy, and perhaps even violence from those who still clung fiercely to the old ways. The editor, a pragmatic man, spoke first. Publishing this would set fire to the whole town. The mayor, thinking of civic harmony and his own political future, nodded in grim agreement. Thaddeus Moss looked at the receipt, at the name Claraara, a woman who had been deliberately erased. He thought about the truth and he thought about peace. He made his choice. "No one else can know," he said quietly. He did not burn the papers. That felt too much like a sin. Instead, he carefully re-rolled them, tied them with a new piece of twine, and as the renovations were completed, he personally oversaw their placement into a new section of the wall, ensuring they were sealed away for another century or forever. The comfort of a quiet present was chosen over the disruptive, painful truth of the past. The decision to rebury the receipt was not made with malice, but with a profound, weary pragmatism. Thaddeus Moss and his colleagues saw themselves not as villains suppressing history, but as guardians of a fragile peace. The South of 1897 was a landscape of simmering tensions, where the embers of the Civil War could be fanned into flame with the slightest breath of controversy. The story contained in those brittle pages was more than a historical account. It was a weapon. In the wrong hands, or perhaps in any hands at all, it had the power to reignite old hatreds, to destroy reputations, and to shatter the delicate, if deeply flawed, reconciliation that had been painfully negotiated over the preceding decades. Moss rationalized his choice by telling himself that the truth would only cause more pain. What good would it do to dredge up such ugliness? The woman, Claraara, was long gone. The men who had wronged her were in their graves. To expose their sins now would only punish their grandchildren, innocent of the specific crimes, who were trying to build a modern Louisiana. He convinced himself that some truths are like surgical instruments. In the right hands, they can heal, but in the wrong circumstances, they can only wound. He was preserving the social fabric, protecting the community from a truth it was not strong enough to bear. This is the seductive logic of the institutional gatekeeper. It is a logic that prioritizes stability over justice, comfort over clarity, and the preservation of power structures over the unsettling power of raw truth. Moss returned to his curated historical society, to his maps and his ledgers, and he buried the knowledge of Claraara as deeply as he had buried the physical document. He became an active participant in crafting the official, palatable narrative of St. Helena Parish. A narrative of brave pioneers, economic triumphs, and the lost cause. Mythology that romanticized the antebellum era and glossed over its brutal realities. In this version of history, men like Duncan Fairholme were pillars of the community, not men who orchestrated the psychological torture of a pregnant woman. The courthouse stood, whitewashed and pristine, its secret safe once more. The system had successfully neutralized a threat, not through violence or overt suppression, but through the quiet, consensus-based action of respectable men who believed they were doing what was best for everyone. They did not see themselves as part of a conspiracy. They saw themselves as a council of elders, making a difficult but necessary decision for the greater good. The story of Claraara was thus condemned to a second death, not in the swamps of Louisiana, but in the filing cabinet of a man's conscience. The receipt's secret was now shared by a new generation of men who, for vastly different but equally compelling reasons, had also chosen to ensure this story died with them. The cycle was complete. The powerful had written the history, and when a fragment of the truth threatened to emerge, the new stewards of that power, men of letters and law, made sure the record was set straight, by being sealed away once more, hidden in plain sight, a ghost in the walls of the very institution that had sanctioned the original sin. But a story like Claraara's refuses to stay buried. It does not fade, it ferments. It becomes a ghost in the soil, a whisper in the cypress groves, a part of the land itself. While Thaddeus Moss believed he had contained the truth, he had only succeeded in containing a piece of paper. The real story had already escaped. It lived on in the descendants of Cypress Hollow, though the community itself, as a physical place, eventually faded back into the swamp from which it was born. Its people dispersed, carrying their history with them into the cities and towns of a slowly changing South. The story of the woman bought for 12 cents became a foundational family legend, a tale of resilience and a secret triumph passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, from grandfather to grandson. It was not a story shared with outsiders, not a tale for history books. It was a private inheritance, a source of quiet strength and identity. They knew their lineage was born from an act of profound cruelty that was, against all odds, transformed into an even more profound act of courage and freedom. They knew the name Claraara, and they knew the name Samuel, the boy born free in the swamp. In Greensburg, a different kind of memory persisted, a vague and unsettling stain on the local consciousness. There were rumors, of course. Old-timers would sometimes speak in hushed tones about the Fairholme family's peculiar intensity, a darkness that seemed to cling to their name long after their wealth had diminished. They would mention the younger brother, William, who vanished without a trace, and the strange story of a slave sold for the price of a loaf of bread. But without proof, it remained just that, a story, a piece of local folklore, easily dismissed. The power of the official record, the one Nathaniel Puigt had so carefully amended, held sway. History, as written by the powerful, had declared that Claraara never existed in any significant way, but the human heart is its own archive. The descendants of the 7 witnesses, the men who signed the original receipt, carried a different, more insidious legacy. It was not a story they told, but a silence they kept. It was a habit of avoidance, a reflexive protection of the family name that had been passed down through generations without the context of the original sin. A great-grandson of one of those witnesses might feel a vague unease when the Fairholme name was mentioned, or a strange reluctance to delve too deeply into the parish's antebellum records, never understanding that he was acting as the unwitting guardian of a secret he himself did not know. He was maintaining a wall his ancestor had helped build. This is how hidden histories truly survive. They do not always need a document to breathe. They live in the DNA of a family's habits, in the unspoken rules of a community, in the landscape itself. The crumbling foundations of Bellamont Plantation, being slowly reclaimed by kudzu and pine, held the memory in their stones. The quiet, murky waters of the swamps held it in their depths. The story was dormant, but it was not dead. It was waiting for a time when the world might be ready to hear it, or for a person determined enough to listen to the whispers of the past. The system, for all its power, could not erase what had been woven into the very fabric of lived experience. It had won the battle of the record, but it was slowly losing the war of memory. The re-emergence of the story began not with a historian, but with a genealogist. Her name was Anya Deschamps, a woman in her 30s from Baton Rouge who was piecing together her own family tree. She was a descendant of Samuel, Claraara's son. The trail had always gone cold in the late 19th century, with census records listing her great-great-grandfather simply as Samuel Laborer, born in Louisiana. The family lore spoke of a hidden community in the swamp and a mother who had been purchased for an insultingly low price, but these were ethereal, unprovable things. Anya, armed with the digital tools of a new century, was determined to find a thread to pull. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected place, a digitized archive of personal letters from a Quaker society in Philadelphia, painstakingly scanned and uploaded by a university. She was searching for any mention of the name Mercer, a name that appeared in her family's oral history as that of the man who helped Claraara. For days, she found nothing. Then she saw it. A letter dated 1854 from I. Mercer to the Society, providing a brief, cautious report on his activities. It did not mention names or places explicitly, relying on coded language, but one line stood out to Anya as if it were written in fire. The subject from the Richmond transaction, the one whose mother's cry I described to you, was successfully relocated with her child to a secure community after a contested public sale initiated by the owner's spite. The owner set a price of 12 pennies. Anya sat back, her heart hammering. This was it. This was the corroboration. The Richmond transaction was the sale of her ancestor Claraara. The 12 pennies was the family legend confirmed in a primary source. The letter was a fragile bridge across 150 years, connecting her directly to Isaiah Mercer's conscience. It was no longer just a story, it was a documented account from a participant, but it was still a single cryptic source. To prove it to the world, she needed the other side of the story. She needed the official record of that contested public sale. She began to search for any court documents from St. Helena Parish in March of 1853. She found the digitized ledger for the parish auctions, and there, listed for March 14, 1853, was an entry that made her blood run cold. It was a terse, bureaucratic line. One female, approx. 23 years, house-trained, sold to J. Doe to settle estate debt, price 12 cents. It was a blatant erasure. The name was gone, the buyer was a phantom, but the date was correct, and the price was the devastating, legendary number. The official record had been falsified, just as the family story had always claimed. The conspiracy of Thaddeus Moss and his contemporaries had held for over a century, but the digital age was now shining a light into the shadows they had so carefully maintained. Anya now had two pieces of the puzzle, the truth from the rescuer's perspective and the lie from the powerful's perspective. The gap between them was the shape of her great-great-great-grandmother's life. She knew the real story was trapped in that gap. Her next step was to go to Greensburg. She needed to find out what or who J. Doe was hiding. She was no longer just a genealogist tracing names. She was an archaeologist of truth, excavating a crime scene that time had tried to conceal. The whispers of the past were finally being answered by the determined curiosity of the present. The St. Helena Parish courthouse felt smaller than Anya had imagined, a monument to a quieter, more stubborn era. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of old wood and floor wax. She introduced herself to the clerk, a woman named Brenda with a kind, tired face, and explained she was conducting genealogical research. She requested to see any ancillary documents related to the March 14, 1853 auction, specifically any receipts or transaction slips that might not have been entered into the main ledger. Brenda was helpful but skeptical. "Honey, if it wasn't in the ledger, it likely doesn't exist, and from that long ago, paper just doesn't last." But Anya was persistent, guided by an intuition she couldn't explain. She mentioned the name Fairholme, and she saw a flicker of something in the clerk's eyes, not recognition, but a deep-seated, habitual caution. "The Fairholme papers were donated to the Historical Society years ago," Brenda said, her tone now more formal. "Mr. Moss's grandson is the curator. You'd have to speak with him." Anya spent the next 2 days in the Historical Society's back room, a place that felt like a tomb for carefully curated memories. Robert Moss, Thaddeus's grandson, was a man in his 60s who wore his family's legacy like a well-fitted but burdensome suit. He was polite but distant, providing her with boxes of bland Fairholme estate records, inventories of cotton, lists of tools, receipts for furniture. There was nothing about human property, nothing about an auction. It was another wall. Frustrated, Anya decided to walk the perimeter of the courthouse itself, studying its architecture. It was during this walk that she noticed a slight discrepancy in the brickwork on the north side, a section that looked newer, smoother than the weathered original stone around it. She found a local contractor having lunch on a bench nearby and asked him about it. "Oh, sure," the man said, wiping his mouth. "Big renovation back in the 90s, 97, I think. My old man worked on that job. Said they found all sorts of junk in the walls, old newspapers, a whiskey bottle, some papers." Anya's breath caught in her throat. "Papers? What kind of papers?" The contractor shrugged. "Dunno. He said the foreman took 'em straight to old man Moss at the Historical Society. Said it was probably just trash." In that moment, the entire landscape of her search shifted. The truth hadn't been lost to time. It had been intercepted. It had been taken directly to the very gatekeeper whose family had a vested interest in keeping the past quiet. Thaddeus Moss hadn't just reburied the receipt. He had created a perfect closed loop. The document was found by his men, delivered to him, and its existence known only to his inner circle. The official record was a lie, and the proof of that lie was locked away in the private collection of the man who had authored the lie. Anya returned to the Historical Society, her heart pounding with a mix of fury and exhilaration. She stood before Robert Moss's desk. "The renovation in 1897, she said, her voice steady. The papers they found in the wall, the receipt for Claraara. I need to see it. Robert Moss looked up from his ledger, his face a pale mask of shock that quickly hardened into a defensive glare. The name Claraara, spoken aloud in that room for the first time in over a century, hung in the air between them. A ghost finally made tangible. The secret was out. The wall, after 144 years, had finally cracked. The silence in the Historical Society's back room was absolute and heavy. Robert Moss did not feign ignorance. The sudden specific demand for the receipt, coupled with the name Claraara, told him the carefully maintained dam had finally broken. The color drained from his face, not from guilt, but from a profound generational sense of failure. He had been tasked as the latest custodian of a silence, and he had failed. He looked at Anya, this determined young woman from another world, and the old, tired arguments, the arguments of stability, of family reputation, of letting sleeping dogs lie, died on his lips. They felt hollow and pathetic in the face of her quiet, righteous resolve. He didn't speak. Instead, he let out a long, weary sigh, the sound of a burden being reluctantly set down after more than a century. He stood, walked to a large, old-fashioned safe tucked away in a corner behind a bookcase, and worked the combination. The door swung open with a heavy clunk. From inside, he retrieved not a cardboard box, but a slender, acid-free archival portfolio. He carried it back to the table and placed it gently in front of Anya. "My grandfather believed he was protecting people," Moss said, his voice barely a whisper, "from the pain, from the consequences." Anya, her hands trembling slightly, untied the portfolio's string. There they were. The papers were browned and fragile at the edges, but the ink was still stark and clear. The formal deed of sale, detailing the property named Claraara, the minimum bid of 12 cents, and the final sale for $10 to Isaiah Mercer. The signatures of the 7 witnesses were like ghostly accusations. And then she turned it over. On the back, in a delicate flowing script that was unmistakably feminine, was the single word, Cyprus. It was the final breathtaking piece of the puzzle. It was Claraara's own voice. A mess, age in a bottle tossed through time, confirming the destination, confirming her agency in her own story. This was not just a record of a transaction, it was a love letter to freedom, a map to a sanctuary, a testament written by the victim of the crime on the very document of her victimization. Anya traced the word with her finger, a direct connection to the woman whose blood ran in her veins. She wasn't just reading history, she was touching it. Robert Moss sank into a chair, watching her. "What will you do with it?" he asked, the question laden with the fear of his ancestors. Anya looked from the receipt to him, her eyes clear and certain. "I'm going to tell her story," she said. "All of it. The 12 cents, the swamps, all of it." She didn't say it with vengeance, but with a sense of solemn duty. The truth, after generations in the dark, was finally going to breathe the open air. The receipt had completed its journey from a tool of oppression to a hidden secret, to a key for liberation. It was no longer Robert Moss's to hide, it was Anya's to share. Anya did not publish the story with a sensational headline or a fiery social media campaign. She understood the weight of what she held. Instead, she began a meticulous, multi-year project, assembling a digital archive that wove together every thread of evidence. She scanned the receipt, front and back, in high resolution, making Claraara's defiant Cyprus visible to the world. She transcribed Isaiah Mercer's Quaker letter and linked it to the falsified parish ledger entry. She used mapping software to overlay the known locations, the Greensburg courthouse, the approximate location of the lost Bellamont plantation, the vast swampland where Cypress Hollow was believed to have been. She then did the most powerful thing of all. She connected the documents to the living. She recorded audio interviews with her own elderly relatives who recounted the family stories of the grandmother who was bought for pennies and found her freedom in the water. She found other descendants of Cypress Hollow scattered across the country and wove their collective oral history into the narrative. The archive was no longer a dry historical record, it was a living tapestry of resistance and resilience. When she finally launched the website and accompanying research paper, the impact was not an explosion, but a deep, resonant tremor. It was picked up by academic journals, then by serious long-form journalists who understood its significance. The story wasn't just about slavery, it was about the mechanics of historical erasure and the tenacity of memory. It became a case study in how to use digital tools to reassemble a fragmented past. In Greensburg, the reaction was complex. For some, it was an uncomfortable, unwelcome spotlight. But for others, particularly the African-American community and a younger generation of white residents, it was a key that unlocked a deeper understanding of the home. The 12-cent slave transformed from a vague rumor into a specific, powerful story of a named woman, Claraara, whose intelligence and dignity shone through the centuries. The official narrative of the parish, the one Thaddeus Moss had so fiercely protected, was permanently, irrevocably complicated. The story's power lay in its undeniable humanity. It wasn't a statistic, it was a portrait. People who read it didn't just learn about the price of a human being. They met Claraara, they felt William's powerlessness, they witnessed Duncan's cold cruelty, and they rode with Isaiah Mercer on his journey of atonement. They saw the receipt, the very paper that defined her as property, and they saw her own hand write the word that defined her as free. It was this intimate human scale that made the history feel not distant, but immediate and essential. The system of control, which had relied on controlling the narrative, had finally lost its grip. The truth, once assembled, was simply too powerful to be ignored. The legacy of Claraara's story is not a simple monument or a line in a revised textbook. Its true impact is more profound and more personal. It serves as a permanent reminder that history is not a settled fact, but an ongoing argument between the official record and the hidden truth. The receipt, now digitized and accessible to anyone with an internet connection, stands as eternal proof that the ledgers written by the powerful are often works of fiction, designed to protect their authors and maintain a comfortable illusion. For descendants of the enslaved, Claraara's story is a testament to the fact that their histories, though often deliberately obscured, can be recovered. That the resilience and agency of their ancestors left traces, in a word on a document, in a family story, in the name of a child, that no amount of whitewashing could completely erase. It validates the oral traditions that were for so long dismissed as mere folklore, proving they were often the careful preservation of a truer, more dangerous history. For descendants of the powerful like the Moss family, and by extension for any society grappling with a difficult past, the story is an unavoidable lesson. It demonstrates that the choice to bury the truth, to prioritize peace over justice, is a temporary fix. The truth has a gravitational pull. It will eventually surface, and when it does, the revelation is often more damaging than the original sin would have been. The attempt to hide becomes a part of the crime itself. And for the wider world, the story of the 12-cent slave is a masterclass in the architecture of power. It shows that control is exercised not only through laws and whips, but through the control of language, of value, and of memory. Duncan Fairholme's act of setting a price of 12 cents was an attempt to annihilate Claraara's humanity through economics. The alteration of the ledge was an attempt to annihilate her from history. Both were profound acts of power, and both were ultimately defeated by the simple, unyielding persistence of the human spirit, and by the courage of those who, generations later, refused to let the silence stand. The story endures because it is not about then, it is about now. It asks us what prices are being set on human value today. It asks us what receipts are being buried in our own digital walls. It forces us to question the official narratives we are fed and to listen for the whispers of the hidden stories, the Claraaras of our own time, who are writing their truth, waiting for someone to finally listen. The final, unspoken lesson of Claraara's story is that freedom is not a destination, but a continuous act of remembrance and reclamation. Cypress Hollow is gone, returned to the swamp. The courthouse still stands, its altered ledger a testament to a lie. Bellamont Plantation exists only as a faint scar on the land. The power of this history does not lie in these physical places, but in the ongoing choice to acknowledge the truth they represent. Every time Anya's website is visited, every time a student reads the transcribed letter from Isaiah Mercer, every time a descendant of St. Helena Parish pauses to consider the weight of the name Fairholme, Claraara's freedom is reaffirmed. Her victory was not just in reaching the swamp, but in ensuring that her story, and by extension the story of countless others like her, refused to be extinguished. The system intended for her to be a footnote, a piece of refuse sold for the price of a loaf of bread. Instead, through a combination of her own defiance, the conscience of one reformed man, and the diligent love of her descendants, she became a landmark. Her life forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable reality that our present is built upon a foundation of silenced screams and buried receipts. To know her story is to accept a responsibility, the responsibility to question the prices set on human dignity in our own era, to be suspicious of clean official narratives, and to listen for the faint, persistent whispers of those whom history has tried to forget. The 12-cent bid was meant to be the end of her story, but it was only the beginning.